saltine crackers. They're nice and comforting, and I always know what to expect when I eat them. One could describe my taste as generic, and you'd be absolutely right. However, saltine crackers have changed quite a bit over the years, so today I thought it'd be a good idea to take a look back at the history of the saltine cracker.
Wrong channel, buddy. This isn't for the food channel.
Oh, well, I guess I can rework this into a video about generic Geometry Dash levels.
Geometry Dash is a funny game. Out of the millions of levels on the servers, only a couple hundred are actually cared about, and even fewer are well made. That begs the question, what makes up the other part of levels on the servers?
About 15 levels cloned into 15 million different levels.
A lot of Geometry Dash is fluff, or forgettable levels that look exactly like 100 others. This idea of generic has changed quite a lot over the years, so let's travel all the way back and watch it grow and evolve. Ah yes, the wonderful year of 2013. The LEGO Republic gunship sold for only $120 instead of the $700 it goes for today. Iron Man 3 had just released, becoming the second Marvel movie to gross $1 billion after 2012's The Avengers, and Thor the Dark World also released apparently. 2013 was also the year that Geometry Dash was thrust into existence, with only 7 main levels and no demon rating. As you can imagine, there wasn't a lot to work with back then. The only available game modes were Cube and Ship, and there were only yellow pads and yellow orbs. Gravity portals were the only other gameplay modifier, and there were only 2 different types of blocks and 1 piece of decoration. You could change the color of the background, but that was the only practical trigger back then. I say practical in terms of making an actual level, since I'm not sure when the start position trigger was added, and I don't want to get something wrong. Because of the severe limitations of what could be done, most levels during this time and for the next few updates would all look very similar to one another. Custom songs also weren't a thing back then, so all levels used one of 7 songs, so everything started to blend together. While 1.1 would introduce the reverse portals and 1.2 the ballgame mode, levels still didn't really change much. Sure, they had 2 new gameplay modifiers to play around with, but really, levels just would not change that much. Then came update 1.3. This update introduced the famous demon difficulty we all know and love, which was probably inspired by the, for the time, insanely difficult level Demon Park by M2 Cole. Back then there was only one all-encompassing demon difficulty, and the different rankings of demons would come several years later in 2.1. Despite there being a new difficulty, difficult levels are really frowned upon. Keep in mind that the community was nowhere near the size it is today, and Geometry Dash was mostly known as a rage game popular YouTubers played for 3 videos and then never touched again. 1.3 was the first update to introduce a new type of block, being these weird platform thingies, as well as a blue bounce pad and orb, which switched the player's gravity. These was probably the first big advancement in gameplay, as levels started to feel at least a little bit different from their 1.0 counterparts, especially considering there was new air decoration as well, being these stars that pulse with the music. Still, these were baby steps compared to what would come in the future. On December 26, 2013, Update 1.4 released. This was a bigger advancement than 1.3 was, as it introduced the size portals, which drastically affected the player's physics, as well as a lot of saw blades and decoration to go along with them, but it still wasn't a massive advancement. This would be the last small advancement for the game, because the levels still felt similar enough to what had come before in the months prior. Aside from Majako, no one really knew how to make art using what the game gave them, and so all the levels felt pretty similar. That would start to change, however, with the introduction of the UFO game mode in Update 1.5. The introduction of the UFO game mode sparked the game's first creating trend, the Flappy Bird levels. These levels were always monotonous and copy-pasted garbage that recreated the infamous mobile game. The copy and paste mechanic was introduced in this update, which definitely helped the rise of the Flappy Bird trend. At this point, levels had progressed to a point where there was now a very clear and distinct difference between what was made in 1.0 and what was made quote-unquote now. Levels still weren't that hard, and relied a lot on memory and confusing design to be difficult. The community was definitely still a hell of a lot smaller, and there wasn't enough of a range of quality between the best levels and the worst levels, which meant most levels still felt very similar to each other. This is a trend we didn't see truly broken until mid 2.1, but it did start to break apart in 1.9, but we'll get to that. For now we have one of the most influential updates to talk about, 1.6. 1.6 introduced the world to Clubstep, which is the most influential main Robtop level by a marathon. Clubstep inspired so many levels, from Clubstep V2 to Silent Club to Ice Carbon Diablo X. 1.6 saw the birth of many a hard level that more often than not was inspired from Clubstep, which is interesting since the community was still pretty bad at the game at this point. From here we get our second form of a generic creating trend, being the hard Clubstep inspired level. This is a trend we wouldn't really ever see die, though it would become a lot rarer and less prominent the longer time went on, which is quite unlike the Flappy Bird trend, which died almost immediately after 1.9 ended. While 1.6 may have been incredibly influential in the field of gameplay, 1.7 would completely shake up the field of decoration. Levels went from looking like this to looking like this. This is the biggest shift to decoration so far, and with the new speed changes, levels were really starting to spread their wings and become something new and unique, and this sentiment would continue in the following updates. Update 1.8 was significantly less influential than the updates around it, but it still introduced the dual game mode as well as a lot of new blocks and slopes for the first time, which allowed people to get real wild and crazy and create levels that definitely wouldn't break when the physics got updated. Since the community was still pretty bad at the game, the dual game mode was not nearly as utilized as it is today, and asymmetrical duels, let alone duels with two different game modes, were few and far between. Following 1.8, update 1.9 released, who could have guessed, and it would be the biggest and most influential update yet. For the first time, people could use custom songs from Newgrounds, which allowed people to be a lot more creative. People other than Majaka would actually start making theme levels, with little art pieces scattered throughout. 1.9 also introduced the Wave game mode, which has become the community's favorite game mode, and has been utilized as the main game mode in countless levels. People like Funny Game also started to push what was possible in the game with levels like Revolution. 1.9 was also the update that introduced the 9 circles trend, which became arguably the largest creating trend in the game, surprisingly enough, since most of the first 50 or so levels were just the base 9 circles effect with a different color scheme. Mega collapse also became a lot more prominent in 1.9, with levels like Supersonic and Bloodbath becoming front and center. The community also started to care a lot more about difficulty in this update, though we wouldn't see the explosion of hard levels until 2.0. The community also swelled to massive numbers never seen before, which meant a lot more levels were being released and rated. However, people were still pretty limited in what they were able to do with the editor. While it was still pretty obvious what a 1.9 level looked like, there wasn't this massive spectrum of what was possible to do. That would change in 2.0 though. 2.0 was the new biggest update the game had seen, and still is probably the biggest update in terms of new creating features added. It introduced an entire new mechanic, being the triggers, and levels could now reach new heights they never could before. Things could move, become invisible, pulse, and be unlocked by keys. However, it's pretty safe to say people didn't really know how to utilize these new features. Early 2.0 levels are often considered to be the worst levels in the game, since people overused the teleportation and movement aspects and created really unfun and not sight-readable levels. People also didn't know how to use the new monsters well, which led to a lot of boss fight levels featuring this chompy-looking ass. It wasn't until Funny Games Serious that people realized, oh yeah, we can use stuff other than Vector the Crocodile for boss fights. However, people went from overusing one type of boss to another with whatever the hell this guy is. The two-hand laser gun plus the angry thing in the middle was used for many boss fights, even into 2.1 with levels like Factory Realm X and Team Z. This style of boss fight was pretty common in Laser Blitz's levels, which had an incredibly unique and interesting style. This was another trend that came from 2.0, and is being continued to this day with modern interpretations from creators like Hell Pegasus and Parallax. However, neither of these trends can hold a candle to the main trend 2.0 is known for creating. These levels were the first levels to be called generic. These levels proved that pumping out the same thing 15 times with a different song was a surefire way to get a rated level. These levels had no real, all-defining name. Until now. These levels are the manufactured levels. These levels were pumped out at absurd rates, with barely any gameplay changes and the most basic decoration needed to get a star rate. These levels took over the servers in about mid 2.0, and their stranglehold on the featured section can still be felt today, even if the style has changed. Creators like Danolex and Adiel would pump out these levels at insane rates, and they would receive a featured rating almost instantly. These levels were never harder than 7 stars most of the time, and most were 4 to 5 stars. This period would continue for the rest of 2.0 and into 2.1, and create hundreds of nearly identical levels that were all rated and featured. As you can probably imagine, this is where people started getting mad at the existence of this trend, and started calling out creators behind this. This wouldn't slow down the avalanche of these levels, however, and it would take until 2018 for this style of empty decoration to fade out. However, by then, there's already a replacement for this style. The modernistic style. Popularization of the style most likely came from Optical, a great and talented creator that created good and unique levels. Modernistic style would replace the empty decoration of the manufactured levels, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all the modernistic levels were created with unique thought and care behind them. In fact, the modernistic style was potentially even more widespread than the empty Adiel style of 2.0. This style is still going strong in 2021 with extreme demons like OPSM1 and I Hate You using a variant of the modernistic style that isn't too far off of Optical's original design. I personally don't see the modernistic style going away until 2.2, and even that's not a guarantee. Another style that started to become very widespread is the glow style. There are countless examples of this, including levels like the Golden, Disentombed, and Virtual Collapse. These levels have, as you guessed, a very high reliance on glow. These levels are often dark and incredibly similar to one another, with the only way to tell them apart being the color of the glow. And even that's not a guarantee, since purple, blue, and green are incredibly common colors to see in this game. This is another trend that probably won't go away until 2.2, but this one has even more of a chance to continue out through a decent chunk of 2.2. Recently, the newest creating trend seems to be flashy effect levels inspired by Para. Cold Sweat and Nightlife are both very popular levels, and many people want to try and replicate them in hopes they could reach the same levels of fame. This has resulted in a lot of very flashy levels, which is something I really despise since I have very sensitive eyes. All these levels also just feel the same as one another, though I don't think this trend will last nearly as long as, say, the modernistic or glow style.
So that was the history of saltine crackers.
Generic geometry dash
Generic
levels.
geometry dash levels. There may have been other smaller creating trends, like with Lonely Travel, but the levels that spawned from that eventually branched off and did their own thing and became their own subgenre of levels. While all the trends I mentioned aren't great and haven't produced great levels, I still think they play an important role in Geometry Dash, as they help the big masterpieces that people care about stand out that much more. It's like the old saying, if everyone's special, then no one's special.